Step out of the car. Now. Judge Elijah Carter sat frozen in his vehicle, his hands still gripping the steering wheel. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the dark, empty street. He had pulled over as soon as he saw the sirens behind him, confused but calm. Now, standing outside his car, a young police officer in a stiff blue uniform had his hand on his holster, his other hand gripping a flashlight pointed directly at Elijah's face. "I said get out," the officer barked. Elijah sighed and reached for the door handle. "Officer, I don't want to hear it. Hands where I can see them." The street was quiet, but tension crackled in the air like a coming storm. Elijah moved slowly, his years of wisdom telling him that any sudden motion could be dangerous. He was a black man in America. He had seen this play out before, just never in a way where he was the one being ordered out of his own car. The officer's name tag read, Officer Blake Reynolds. A rookie barely passed his academy days. His stance was aggressive, his eyes narrowed with authority he had not yet earned. "I'm Judge Elijah Carter," Elijah said evenly. "You're making a—" "I don't care if you're the president," Reynolds snapped. "License and registration." Now, Elijah clenched his jaw. The disrespect was astounding, but something told him this was about to get worse. Reynolds took a step closer, his fingers tapping the side of his gun. "Are you refusing an order, sir?" Elijah knew that tone. It was the sound of a man looking for an excuse. And then, just as he was about to reach for his wallet, it happened. The young officer lunged, grabbing Elijah's arm and yanking him out of the vehicle. Elijah stumbled, his knees slamming against the pavement as the officer shoved him down. The sting shot up his leg, but before he could even speak, cold steel cuffs snapped around his wrists. "You're under arrest," Reynolds said smugly. Elijah's head snapped up, his eyes burning with disbelief. For what? For resisting a police officer. The sheer absurdity of the words made Elijah's chest tighten. The street was empty. No witnesses. No cameras. Just a young cop who thought he was untouchable. But what Reynolds didn't know, what he was about to learn in the most shocking way possible, was that the man he just put in handcuffs wasn't just any black man. He was the most powerful judge in the city. And in that moment, as Elijah lay on the pavement, something inside him hardened. This wasn't going to end the way Officer Reynolds thought it would. Hours earlier, it had been a normal day. Judge Elijah Carter had spent the morning in court, handling a particularly difficult case. He was a respected man, known for his fairness and wisdom. At 56 years old, he had seen nearly everything the legal system had to offer, the good, the bad, and the ugly. As one of the few black judges in the city, he knew the weight of his position. He had worked twice as hard as many of his colleagues to get where he was, and he carried himself with quiet dignity. That evening, after a long day of hearings, he left the courthouse, eager to get home. His wife, Diane, had cooked his favorite meal, and their granddaughter was visiting for the weekend. But as he drove down the quiet streets, he noticed the flashing lights in his rearview mirror. At first, he thought nothing of it. He wasn't speeding. He hadn't broken any laws. Yet the sirens didn't pass him. They followed. His stomach tightened. He knew the rules for encounters like this. Hands visible. No sudden movements. Calm voice. He slowed the car, pulling over to the curb. As soon as he stopped, the patrol car screeched behind him. The door slammed open, and a young officer stepped out aggressively. Officer Blake Reynolds. Elijah had never seen him before. The officer was young, probably fresh out of the academy. His posture was rigid, his hand hovering near his gun like it was an extension of his body. Elijah lowered his window. "Good evening, officer. Is there a problem?" Reynolds narrowed his eyes. License and registration. No greeting, no explanation, just immediate authority. Elijah reached for his glove compartment, his movements slow and deliberate. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" I said license and registration. A knot formed in Elijah's stomach. Something about this officer felt off. He wasn't just being cautious. He was itching for control. Elijah handed over his documents, keeping his voice steady. "Here you go." Reynolds snatched them without a word. His eyes flicked over Elijah's name. Then, something changed in his expression. "Elijah Carter," Reynolds muttered, as if testing the name in his mouth. That's funny. You some kind of judge or something? Elijah's lips pressed together. Yes. Reynolds chuckled. A slow, mocking sound. Huh. Well, Judge Carter, let's see if that means anything to me. The tension grew heavier. Elijah could feel where this was heading. Then came the order. Step out of the car. Elijah's pulse quickened. This wasn't standard procedure. Officer, he said carefully, I've done nothing wrong. Can you tell me why I need to step out? Reynolds smirked. Because I said so. And just like that, the moment spiraled. The young officer's power trip exploded into an unnecessary show of force. The grab, the shove, the cold, biting cuffs. Now, as Elijah sat on the pavement, he realized something chilling. Reynolds wasn't just reckless. He had no idea who he had just arrested. And when the truth came out, the entire city would be watching. The night was far from over, and what happened next would shake the entire police department to its core. The cold pavement pressed against Judge Elijah Carter's knees as the handcuffs bit into his wrists. He kept his breathing steady, refusing to give Officer Reynolds the reaction he clearly wanted. But deep inside, a storm raged. This wasn't just an arrest. This was an insult. And soon, Reynolds would understand just how badly he had messed up. The young officer grabbed Elijah by the arm and hauled him up. You can explain yourself at the station, he said with a smirk. That is, if anyone actually cares what you have to say. Elijah didn't respond. He had spent his entire career in a courtroom, handling men like Reynolds, the type who thought a badge made them untouchable. But power built on arrogance always came crashing down. The police car's back door swung open, and Reynolds shoved Elijah inside. The door slammed shut. The judge sat in the darkness of the back seat, the city lights blurring outside the window as the car sped toward the station. Then, the radio crackled to life. Unit 47, status update. Reynolds picked up the radio. I have a male suspect in custody. Transporting now. Name? The dispatcher asked. Reynolds glanced at the mirror, smirking at Elijah through the reflection. Elijah Carter. There was a long silence on the other end. Then, repeat that, Officer Reynolds? Reynolds frowned. I said I have a... Did you say Elijah Carter? As in Judge Carter? The tone of the dispatcher's voice shifted completely. Reynolds blinked, clearly not understanding why his name had caused such a reaction. Yeah, he answered hesitantly. Then came the yelling. Are you out of your damn mind? Reynolds flinched at the sheer volume of the response. What? You just arrested one of the most powerful judges in the state. Do you have any idea what you've done? Turn that car around. Now, Elijah watched from the back seat as Reynolds froze. The young officer's face went pale as reality sank in. He hadn't just arrested a random black man. He had put a superior of the entire legal system in cuffs. A man with friends in the highest places. Reynolds swallowed hard, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. I was just following protocol. That wasn't protocol, you idiot. The dispatcher's voice was sharp with panic. You're about to cost the department a lawsuit we can't afford. Do you realize how bad this looks? Reynolds' breath became uneven. For the first time since this entire situation started, he was scared. Elijah could see it, and he wasn't going to make this easy for him. Reynolds' fingers trembled as he grabbed the radio again. What do I do? He asked, his voice much smaller now. Get him out of those cuffs. Apologize. Beg if you have to, the dispatcher snapped. And pray he doesn't destroy your entire career. A long silence filled the car. Then, with a jerk, Reynolds pulled over to the side of the road. The street was empty, lit only by the glow of the streetlights. Elijah remained still as the officer stepped out, hurried around the car, and yanked the back door open. The judge slowly turned his head, looking up at Reynolds with an unreadable expression. The young officer swallowed. His arrogance was gone. Sir, Reynolds stammered, reaching for his key. Let's get these cuffs off you. Elijah didn't move. He let the officer struggle, let him sweat for a few more seconds. Then, click, the cuffs popped open. Elijah rubbed his wrists, taking his time, making sure Reynolds knew exactly how much power had just shifted between them. I made a mistake, Reynolds mumbled. Elijah slowly stood up, towering over the officer. A mistake. The The judge's voice was calm, but beneath it, there was thunder. Reynolds forced a nervous smile. Yeah, just a misunderstanding. No hard feelings, right? Elijah stepped closer. Reynolds stepped back. No hard feelings, the judge repeated. His voice was low, controlled. You pulled me over without cause. You disrespected me. You threw me to the ground like I was a criminal. Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came out. I could ruin you, Elijah continued, his gaze locked onto the young officer. I could have you fired by sunrise. I could walk into that police department tomorrow and have your badge on my desk before you even take another breath. Reynolds' face turned a shade paler. Elijah held his stare for a long, heavy moment. Then, he took a deep breath, shaking his head. But I won't. Reynolds blinked. Why you won't? No. Elijah stepped around him and walked away, his presence still commanding even in the night air. Reynolds turned, still stunned. You're just going to let me go? Elijah stopped beside his car and opened the door. He looked back one last time. You're not worth ruining. And with that, he slid into his seat and drove away. Reynolds stood frozen, watching the taillights fade into the distance. His legs felt weak. His hands shook, because he knew he had just been spared from the worst mistake of his life. But little did either of them know. This wasn't over, not even close, because the next morning, the entire city would wake up to the biggest scandal the police department had ever faced. And Officer Reynolds? He wasn't getting out of this that easily. The next morning, the city erupted. By sunrise, Judge Elijah Carter's illegal arrest was the only thing people were talking about. It started with whispers in the courthouse. Then it spread to law offices, police stations, and newsrooms. By the time coffee shops opened, the scandal had hit the airwaves. It was everywhere. Black judge wrongly arrested. Racial profiling or police incompetence. Young officer arrest, judge. Police department under fire. Who was Officer Blake Reynolds? Rookie cop's career in jeopardy after shocking arrest. By mid-morning, the footage was on TV. Someone, a resident with a security camera, had captured the entire thing from across the street. The way Reynolds had yanked the judge out of the car. The way he shoved him onto the pavement. The look of arrogance on his face as he snapped the cuffs shut. It was damning. And inside the police station, Officer Blake Reynolds was watching it all fall apart. He sat stiffly in a hard plastic chair, his leg bouncing uncontrollably. He had been ordered to stay in the station until further notice, which felt more like house arrest than anything. Officers passed by him, some whispering, some shaking their heads. His stomach was in knots. He had woken up feeling like his world had shifted overnight. And now he was about to be called into the chief's office. The door swung open. Reynolds, get in here. His heart slammed against his ribs as he jumped to his feet and hurried inside. Chief Douglas Harlan sat behind a massive oak desk, his eyes burning into Reynolds with a rage that made his stomach churn. The moment the door shut, boom, a folder slammed onto the desk. The chief had thrown it so hard that some papers slid onto the floor. You want to tell me what the hell you were thinking last night? Chief Harlan growled. Reynolds swallowed hard. Sir, Shut up. Reynolds' mouth snapped shut. The chief leaned forward. Do you have any idea who Judge Carter is? Do you have any clue what you've done? Reynolds opened his mouth, then closed it. Because, honestly, he hadn't known. Not really. Harlan continued, his voice low and sharp. Judge Carter isn't just a judge. He's one of the most respected men in this state. He's been on the bench for 20 years. He's friends with mayors, governors, and half the damn legal system. And you decided to throw him onto the street like some punk off the block. Reynolds shifted in his seat. His throat was dry. Sir, you embarrassed this department. Harlan bellowed. You put us in a national scandal. And now I've got reporters, civil rights lawyers, and half of City Hall demanding your badge. Reynolds' pulse spiked. Sir, I was just doing my job. The chief's eyes went dark. Your job. There was a sharp silence. Then Harlan spoke again, calmly this time. And that was somehow worse. You messed with the wrong man, Reynolds. Reynolds clenched his jaw. What happens now? The chief leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand down his face. He looked exhausted. That's up to Judge Carter, he muttered. We've already reached out to him. He's coming in this afternoon. And if he wants your badge? If he wants you gone? The chief exhaled heavily. You're done. Reynolds' stomach twisted into a tight, sick knot. This couldn't be happening. Sir, there has to be another way. The chief shook his head. I can't save you from this. The mayor is breathing down my neck. The commissioner is furious. If Carter says he wants you out, then you're out. Reynolds gritted his teeth. This wasn't fair. He had worked his whole life to get into the police force. He had sacrificed everything. And now, one bad night was about to take it all away? No, no, he couldn't let that happen. He had to fix this. But how? And then, a terrible thought crept into his mind. What if Judge Carter didn't just want him fired? What if he wanted him arrested? Reynolds had assaulted a judge. That wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime. Would Carter really press charges? Reynolds' pulse pounded as the door suddenly swung open again. One of the department's senior officers stepped inside. His face was tense. He's here. A heavy silence filled the room. The chief exhaled slowly, then nodded. Send him in. Reynolds felt his chest tighten, and then the door opened again, and Judge Elijah Carter stepped inside. The moment he entered, the energy in the room shifted. The quiet dignity, the authority in his posture, the look in his eyes that said, you know exactly what you did. Reynolds felt small. Judge Carter's gaze flicked over him, then settled on the chief. I assume you know why I'm here, the judge said, his voice calm, but heavy with purpose. The chief nodded. Yes, sir. Carter crossed his arms. Good, because we need to discuss what's going to happen next. Reynolds sat frozen, his heart racing. And then, Judge Carter turned to face him directly. For the first time since last night, the two men locked eyes. Reynolds felt his stomach drop. And then, in the calmest, most terrifying voice imaginable, the judge said, Let's talk about your future, Officer Reynolds. If you even have one. A heavy silence hung in the chief's office. Officer Blake Reynolds sat stiffly in his chair, his pulse hammering in his ears. Across from him, Judge Elijah Carter stared him down, his gaze sharp and unreadable. Chief Douglas Harlan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He knew the situation was delicate. One wrong move, and Reynolds was finished. But Judge Carter wasn't speaking. He was letting the silence stretch, letting the weight of it settle over the room like a dark storm cloud. Then, finally he spoke. Tell me, Officer Reynolds. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Do you know why you're in this mess? Reynolds swallowed hard. He wasn't sure what to say. He knew what the judge wanted to hear, but I was doing my job, he said carefully. Carter's expression didn't change, but the room got colder. Your job, the judge repeated. His voice was still eerily controlled, but dangerous. Your job is to uphold the law, not to abuse it. Reynolds felt his chest tighten. Sir, you threw me to the ground, Carter continued, his voice like a blade. You handcuffed me. You humiliated me in the street. And you never even told me why I was being detained. The words hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. Judge Carter leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with power. If I had been an ordinary man last night, do you know what could have happened? He asked, his voice low. What if I had reached for my wallet too quickly? What if I had flinched? Would I still be sitting here today? Or would I be another tragic accident on the news? Reynolds had no answer, because deep down, he knew the truth. Judge Carter sat back, watching him, waiting. Reynolds clenched his jaw. I didn't know who you were, he admitted. A humorless chuckle left Carter's lips. So if you had known, you wouldn't have treated me like that. Reynolds' face burned. Carter shook his head. That tells me everything I need to know. Chief Harlan cleared his throat, breaking the tension. Judge Carter, I know this is a serious situation, he said carefully. But we'd like to know, what do you want to happen here? A beat of silence passed. Then Carter spoke. I don't want his job. Reynolds' head snapped up. What? Chief Harlan looked equally shocked. You don't. Carter shook his head. No. Firing him is too easy. His eyes cut toward Reynolds. And frankly, it doesn't fix the real issue. Reynolds' relief was short-lived, because something in the judge's voice made it clear. He wasn't getting off easy. I want him to learn, Carter said simply. The chief blinked. Judge, with all due respect, How do you expect us to do that? Carter's gaze was locked onto Reynolds now. I want him to see what it's like on the other side. The words sent a chill down Reynolds' spine. Carter leaned forward again, his expression unreadable. I want him to spend a month working in the very communities he polices. No badge, no gun, no authority. Reynolds felt his throat go dry. He's going to see what it's like to be the man in the street, Carter continued. To be questioned, to be doubted, to be treated like he's less than human. Reynolds' stomach twisted. You can't be serious. Carter's eyes darkened. You shoved me to the ground, he said, his voice sharp. Now it's your turn to be at the mercy of others. Reynolds turned to the chief, pleading silently. The chief sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Then he turned to Carter. And if we agree to this? Carter stood up, straightening his suit jacket. If he does it, I won't press charges, he said simply. The words slammed into Reynolds like a truck. Charges? His voice cracked. I could be arrested? Carter didn't blink. What you did to me was illegal. If I wanted, I could have you in cuffs right now. Reynolds' breath caught in his throat. This was his only chance. The chief turned to Reynolds. His face was grim. You have a decision to make, son. Reynolds' hands balled into fists. His entire body was tense, his pride screaming at him to refuse. But the truth was clear. If he said no, he'd be fired. Worse, he might end up in court himself. And Judge Carter? He wouldn't lose a wink of sleep over it. Reynolds gritted his teeth. He had no choice. Fine, he muttered. I'll do it. Judge Carter studied him for a moment. Then, finally, he nodded. Good, he said. Then he turned and walked out the door. Reynolds slumped back in his chair, his mind racing. 1 month. He had to survive 1 month of this punishment. How bad could it be? But what he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that this would be the hardest, most humiliating month of his life. And by the time it was over, he would never be the same. Officer Blake Reynolds stood outside the Eastwood Community Center, staring at the rundown brick building with a mix of frustration and dread. This was where he would be spending the next month. No badge, no gun, no authority, just him in the very streets he had once patrolled, now forced to see the world from the other side. The punishment was humiliating. Judge Carter had personally arranged for him to work here, volunteering in the community, engaging with people he would normally see through the lens of law enforcement. He had to clock in 40 hours a week under the supervision of people who didn't trust him. And now, standing at the door, he could already feel the eyes watching him. The judge's conditions were clear: no special treatment, no shortcuts, and most importantly, he had to listen. The door swung open before he could knock. A tall, broad-shouldered black man stood in the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He wore a dark hoodie and jeans, his presence commanding. Reynolds immediately recognized him. Terrence Wilkes. A former gang member turned community leader, Wilkes had once been a name Reynolds saw in arrest reports. Now, he ran Eastwood Community Center, helping kids stay off the streets. And the look in Wilkes' eyes told Reynolds exactly what he thought about him. You lost, Wilkes asked, voice laced with sarcasm. Reynolds squared his shoulders. I'm here to work. Wilkes raised an eyebrow. Work? He chuckled darkly. Ain't that funny? Last time you were around here, you were throwing my cousin in a squad car. Reynolds' jaw tightened. Wilkes studied him for a long moment, then finally stepped aside. Come on in, officer. The emphasis on officer wasn't lost on Reynolds. It wasn't respect. It was mocking. Reynolds stepped inside, feeling the glares from people in the center. Teenagers playing basketball stopped dribbling and whispered to each other. Women working the food station exchanged knowing glances. A few men in the back folded their arms, watching him like a hawk. Reynolds wasn't welcome here, and he knew it. Wilkes led him to a small office in the back. All right, he said, leaning against the desk. Let's get something straight. You're not a cop here. You don't get to bark orders. You don't get to pull rank. You're just another worker. Reynolds clenched his jaw, but nodded. Wilkes smirked. Good. Now, since you're so eager to be part of the community, we're starting you at the bottom. Reynolds stiffened. What does that mean? Wilkes grinned. It wasn't friendly. Means you're on janitor duty. A beat of silence. Then, Reynolds bristled. You're joking. Wilkes leaned in. Does it look like I'm joking? Reynolds' face burned with rage. He had spent years in the academy, trained in tactical operations, and now he was being told to clean floors? "I'm not a damn janitor," he growled. Wilkes chuckled. "You're not a cop here either." Reynolds' fists clenched, but he said nothing. Wilkes patted his shoulder hard. "Mop's in the closet. You start in the cafeteria." Then, without another word, he walked out, leaving Reynolds standing there, boiling in humiliation. This wasn't just a punishment. This was humbling him, and he hated every second of it. The mop slapped against the tile floor, water streaking beneath Reynolds' frustrated strokes. The cafeteria was nearly empty, except for a few kids watching him from a nearby table, whispering and giggling. "Yo," one of them called out. "Why's a cop cleaning floors?" Another kid laughed. "Maybe he got fired." Reynolds gritted his teeth. "Ignore them." But then a familiar voice cut through the room. Because he finally got put in his place. Reynolds turned and froze. Standing in the doorway, Judge Elijah Carter watched him with a cold, unreadable expression. Reynolds felt a fresh wave of humiliation. Carter stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the mop in Reynolds' hands. "Well," he said, voice calm, "I see you're adjusting." Reynolds swallowed his anger. "What do you want?" Carter walked past him, stopping at one of the tables. "I wanted to see for myself if you were actually following through." He tapped his fingers against the wooden surface. "And I have to say, I expected more resistance." Reynolds forced himself to stay calm. "I don't have a choice, do I?" Carter smirked. And that's the first lesson, isn't it?" Reynolds frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Carter's gaze was sharp. "Now you know what it's like to have no power." Reynolds' grip tightened around the mop handle. Carter leaned slightly toward him. "You don't like how this feels, do you?" Reynolds clenched his jaw, but said nothing. Carter sighed, standing up straight. "Well, get used to it." He turned toward the exit, but before he left, he paused. 1 month, Carter said over his shoulder. 30 days to prove you can change." His voice turned cooler. "Don't waste them." And then he walked out. Reynolds stood there, his body stiff, his blood boiling. He wasn't just here to mop floors. This was a test. And if he failed, he wouldn't just lose his job. He'd lose everything. The days passed slowly, each one feeling longer than the last. Officer Blake Reynolds, no, just Blake now, since no one here acknowledged his badge, found himself sinking into a daily routine he hated. He mopped floors. He took out garbage. He stacked chairs and cleaned tables in the cafeteria. Menial, humiliating work. But the worst part? The stares. Everywhere he went, people watched him. Some with amusement, some with skepticism, and some with pure disgust. He wasn't a cop here. He was an outsider. A man serving his sentence, except instead of a jail cell, he was trapped inside this community center, a place filled with the very people he once saw as nothing more than problems. And then, after a week of suffering in silence, things got worse. Because someone finally snapped. It was late afternoon when it happened. Blake had just finished cleaning the gym floor when he heard voices escalating in the next room. Loud, angry. His instincts kicked in before he could think. He dropped the mop and headed toward the commotion. When he pushed open the door, he froze. 2 teenage boys stood nose to nose, their hands balled into fists. One of them, Malik Carter, a 17-year-old kid with sharp eyes and a permanent scowl, was already in a fighting stance. Blake recognized him. He was Judge Carter's nephew. The other boy, Jared Lawson, was taller, more muscular, and radiated danger. Blake had seen his type before, angry, looking for an excuse. And that excuse was about to come, because Jared suddenly shoved Malik. Hard. Malik stumbled back, rage flashing in his eyes. Say it again, Jared sneered. Call me a punk one more time. Blake took a step forward, instincts screaming at him to break it up. But before he could speak, Malik swung. His fist crashed into Jared's jaw with a sickening crack. Jared staggered, then lunged forward, swinging wildly. The room erupted. Shouts filled the air. Kids backed up, forming a messy circle. Some cheered, some screamed. And Blake? He acted. Faster than he should have. He stepped in, grabbing Malik's arm before he could throw another punch. Hey, that's enough. But the moment his hand touched Malik, everything shifted. The entire room went dead silent. And then Malik jerked away violently, his face twisting in disgust. "Don't touch me, cop," he snarled. Blake's stomach dropped. Jared wiped his bloody lip and laughed bitterly. "Oh, this is rich. The pig wants to play peacekeeper now." Blake's hands clenched into fists. "I'm just trying to stop you from doing something stupid." Malik's eyes burned with fury. "What do you care?" he snapped. "You're just here 'cause you got caught. You don't give a damn about us." Blake felt every pair of eyes in the room drilling into him, waiting for him to speak, to defend himself, to prove he wasn't what they thought he was. But for the first time in his life, he had no words, because Malik was right. Blake hadn't come here to help. He had come to survive. And now, standing in the middle of a room filled with people who hated him, he realized something terrifying. He didn't know how to change their minds, because deep down, he wasn't even sure he wanted to. The incident spread like wildfire. By the time Blake finished his shift, everyone had heard about it. Terrence Wilkes called him into his office, his face unreadable. "Tell me what happened," he said, folding his arms. Blake exhaled slowly. "Two kids got into a fight. I broke it up." Wilkes' expression hardened. "That's not what I heard." Blake narrowed his eyes. "And what did you hear?" Wilkes leaned forward. "I heard you put your hands on Judge Carter's nephew." Blake's stomach dropped. Wilkes shook his head. "You really don't get it, do you?" Blake frowned. "What the hell are you talking about?" Wilkes sighed, rubbing his temples. "Man, listen. Around here, these kids don't see you as a guy doing community service. They see you as a threat. A cop who got in trouble, but still thinks he's in charge." Blake scoffed. "So what? I'm just supposed to stand back and let them beat the hell out of each other." Wilkes gave him "You're supposed to earn their trust before you go putting your hands on them." Blake felt a flash of frustration. "So what? I should have just let Malik get punched." Wilkes shook his head. "You should have let me or one of the other staff handle it." His voice dropped lower. "Because the moment you grabbed that kid, you reminded every person in that room of what cops do to them every day." Blake felt his jaw tighten. He wanted to argue, to say that he wasn't one of those cops. But deep down, he wasn't sure if that was true. Wilkes studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke again. "I got a call from Judge Carter." Blake's entire body stiffened. Wilkes smirked slightly. "Don't worry. He's not pressing charges." Blake exhaled sharply. "Good." "But," Wilkes added, his smirk fading, "he's coming to see you tomorrow." Blake felt his pulse spike. "What? What?" Wilkes shrugged. "Guess he wants to see if you learned anything yet." Blake swallowed hard, because he already knew the answer to that. He hadn't. And the worst part? He wasn't sure if he even wanted to. The next morning, Judge Elijah Carter arrived. Blake Reynolds stood stiffly in the Eastwood Community Center's lobby, his arms crossed, his gut twisted in frustration. He had barely slept the night before, replaying Wilkes' words in his head, knowing that today wouldn't go his way. And now, as the judge walked in, his presence commanding, Blake felt his stomach tighten. Carter wasn't here to chat. He was here to judge him. The cafeteria had been cleared out for privacy. Blake sat across from the judge at one of the long tables, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably. Carter finally broke it. "I heard about what happened yesterday," he said, his voice even. Blake exhaled sharply, leaning back in his chair. "Yeah? You hear I was just trying to break up a fight." Carter's gaze didn't waver. "I heard you put your hands on a kid who doesn't trust you." Blake's jaw clenched. The judge sighed, resting his hands on the table. "You still don't get it, do you?" Blake's frustration boiled over. "Get what?" Carter's eyes narrowed. "Why they hate you." Blake blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of it. The judge leaned forward. "You spent years walking these streets in uniform. You stopped kids like Malik, questioned them, probably even arrested them. And now, you expect them to see you as anything but the enemy." Blake bristled. "I was doing my job." Carter's voice sharpened. "Was throwing me on the ground doing your job too?" Blake's face burned. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Finally, Carter sighed, shaking his head. "You're not learning. And if you're not learning, then this entire month is a waste." Blake frowned. "So what? You want me to sit here and let people walk all over me? Let these kids beat the hell out of each other while I stand back?" Carter studied him for a long moment. Then, his expression softened, just slightly. "No," he said. I want you to understand why they see you as the bad guy. And I want you to change that. Blake swallowed. And how am I supposed to do that? Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. Then, I have an idea. 30 minutes later, Blake regretted everything. He stood in front of a crowded room, every single seat filled with teenagers from the neighborhood. Judge Carter sat in the front row, arms crossed, watching intently. And, standing beside Blake, looking way too amused, was Terrence Wilkes. Wilkes clapped his hands together. All right, everyone, this is Officer Blake Reynolds. A few of the kids scoffed. Some crossed their arms. Others just glared. Blake had never felt more uncomfortable in his life. Wilkes grinned. And today, we're going to have some fun. Y'all get to ask him anything you want. Blake stiffened. Wait. Wilkes turned to him. What? You afraid of a few questions? Blake's jaw clenched. He looked out at the dozens of watching eyes, waiting for him to mess up. Then slowly he exhaled. Fine. Wilkes smirked. All right. First question. Who's got one? Immediately, a hand shot up. A teenage girl with long braids, no older than 16. Wilkes nodded toward her. Go ahead, Tasha. Tasha crossed her arms. You ever pulled a gun on a black kid before? The room went dead silent. Blake's pulse spiked. He wasn't expecting that at all. He hesitated. I mean, I've drawn my weapon before, yeah. Tasha's eyes narrowed. On black people, Blake felt trapped. He glanced at Carter, who remained stone-faced. He exhaled slowly. Yes. Tasha scoffed. Figured. Blake felt the judgment in the room. The tension grew. Another hand went up. A boy in a hoodie, his face partially hidden under the fabric. Wilkes nodded at him. Go ahead, Chris. Chris lowered his hood. His voice was quiet but sharp. Have you ever arrested someone who didn't do anything wrong? Blake felt his throat tighten. Chris's gaze burned into him. Yes or no? Blake hesitated, because the truth was, yes, he had. Maybe not knowingly, but he had. He had taken people in on weak charges, pulled people over without real cause, followed orders without questioning if they were right. His chest felt tight. The weight of every decision he made suddenly crashed down on him. And before he could even answer, Chris spoke again. My brother went to jail for something he didn't do, he said, his voice quiet. You ever think about what happens to the people you arrest? Or do you just throw them away and move on? Blake felt his stomach sink. The entire room was waiting for an excuse, a lie, a justification. But for the first time, Blake had none. He didn't move on. He never thought about them, never cared. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent years telling himself he was doing the right thing, that he was helping. But in this room, surrounded by the people he had affected, he finally understood the truth. They didn't hate him because he wore a uniform. They hated him because of what that uniform meant. And for the first time, Blake wasn't sure if he could argue with them. Judge Carter stood as the session ended. As the teenagers filtered out of the room, Blake remained seated, staring at the floor, his mind racing. Carter stepped beside him, hands in his pockets. Not as easy when you don't have a badge, is it? He said quietly. Blake didn't answer. Carter studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good, he said simply. Then he turned and walked out, leaving Blake alone with the weight of his thoughts. And for the first time since this whole thing started, Blake wondered if he was the villain of this story. Blake Reynolds didn't sleep that night. He lay in his small, cramped apartment, staring at the ceiling, his mind refusing to shut off. The voices from earlier played on a loop. You ever pulled a gun on a black kid before? Have you ever arrested someone who didn't do anything wrong? Do you just throw them away and move on? Every word felt like a blade, cutting deeper than he wanted to admit. Because the truth was, he didn't have answers. And that scared him. By morning, exhaustion clung to him like a second skin. But the day didn't care. When he arrived at the Eastwood Community Center, he was immediately thrown back into work, cleaning, moving supplies, unloading food deliveries. The usual humiliation. Except today, there was something worse. The stares. They weren't just skeptical anymore. They were angry. Before, the people here saw him as an intruder. Now, they saw him as a problem. And then, as if to prove that today was going to be hell, Malik Carter walked in. Blake stiffened. The teenagers spotted him instantly, his face hardening. He leaned against the table, arms crossed, his jaw tight. Blake braced himself, because Malik wasn't done with him yet. 15 minutes later, Blake was stacking chairs in the main room when Malik approached. "What are you still doing here?" Malik's voice was sharp, cutting. Blake sighed, keeping his focus on the chair in his hands. "I work here, same as you." Malik scoffed. "You don't work here. You're serving time." Blake tensed. "What do you want, kid?" Malik stepped closer. "I want to know why you really became a cop." Blake finally looked at him. "What?" "You heard me." Malik's expression didn't waver. "Why'd you become a cop? And don't give me some bull about helping people." Blake exhaled, running a hand over his face. "I don't owe you an explanation." Malik smirked. "That means you don't have a good answer." Blake gritted his teeth. "I became a cop because it was what I was meant to do." Malik raised an eyebrow. "Says who?" Blake hesitated, because suddenly he wasn't sure. For years, he told himself the same story. He wanted to make a difference, to serve and protect. But now, standing here, stripped of his authority, with nothing but these people's judgment pressing down on him, he wasn't sure if that was ever true. Malik studied his face and shook his head. "Yeah, that's what I thought." Then, before Blake could respond, Malik turned and walked away, leaving him alone with a question he didn't know how to answer. That evening, Blake went to Judge Carter's house. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed to. It was a simple, well-kept home on the nicer side of the city. Nothing flashy, but respectable. Just like the man himself. Blake hesitated before knocking. A moment later, the door swung open. Judge Carter stood there, wearing a sweater and slacks, looking more like a father than a man who had once sentenced criminals to life. He raised an eyebrow. "Didn't expect to see you here." Blake exhaled. "I need to talk." Carter studied him for a moment, then stepped aside. "Come in." Blake entered, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. Carter led him to the living room, gesturing to a chair. Blake sat, his hands clasped tightly. A long silence stretched between them. Then, "I don't know who I am without the badge." The words spilled from Blake's mouth before he could stop them. Carter leaned back, watching him closely. "Explain." Blake swallowed. "My whole life, I've been told that being a cop meant something, that it made me one of the good guys. But now, I don't know." He let out a humorless laugh. "Hell, I don't even know if I was ever one of the good guys to begin with." Carter didn't speak. He let the silence linger. Then, "Why do you think that?" Blake's jaw tightened. "Because I'm starting to realize that maybe I was never helping anyone." Carter's eyes didn't leave him. "That's the first honest thing you've said." Blake exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. "So what now?" Carter took a sip from the glass of water beside him, then set it down. "That depends," he said. "Do you actually want to change? Or do you just want to survive this month and get back to your old life?" Blake froze, because the truth was, he didn't know. Carter nodded, as if reading his mind. "You have a decision to make, Reynolds." His voice was quiet but firm. "You can either pretend to change until your time here is up, or you can actually do the work." Blake swallowed hard. Carter's voice turned sharper. "Figure out which man you want to be." Blake stood abruptly, his pulse pounding. I need to go." Carter just nodded. "Take your time, but don't take too long." Blake turned and walked out the door, his thoughts spinning. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to be the man he had always been, and that scared him more than anything. Blake Reynolds showed up to work the next morning, but something was different. For the past 2 weeks, he had dragged himself to the Eastwood Community Center, counting the days until he was free. But today, for the first time, he wasn't just going through the motions, because Judge Carter's words were still echoing in his head. Figure out which man you want to be. And no matter how hard Blake tried to ignore it, he knew the truth. He didn't want to go back to being the same man who threw Judge Carter to the ground that night. But he didn't know how to be anything else. Yet, "Yo, cop." Blake turned around. Malik Carter stood behind him, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Blake tensed, already expecting another argument. "What?" Malik studied him for a long moment, then tossed something at his chest. Blake caught it instinctively. "A basketball." He frowned. "What's this?" Malik smirked. "You ever actually play with us? Or are you just good at watching?" Blake blinked. Malik tilted his head toward the outdoor court. "1-on-1. You win. I'll stop calling you cop." Blake hesitated. This had to be a trap. Malik had been waiting for an excuse to embarrass him. But then Blake looked around and realized they weren't alone. The other kids were watching. Some leaned against the fence, waiting to see what would happen. Blake wasn't just playing Malik. He was being tested. He exhaled slowly, tossing the ball back. Fine. Malik grinned. Let's go. The game started off badly for Blake. Malik was fast, faster than Blake expected. The teenager zipped past him, weaving between movements with ease, sinking shots like it was second nature. Blake, on the other hand, was rusty as hell. His footwork was sloppy. His timing was off. Every time he thought he had an opening, Malik slipped right past him, mocking him the whole time. Come on, old man, Malik taunted, easily dodging another attempt at defense. Y'all cops move this slow when you chase people too? Laughter erupted from the sidelines. Blake gritted his teeth, but something strange happened. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't angry. He wasn't embarrassed. He was having fun. He laughed, shaking his head. I'm just getting warmed up. Malik arched an eyebrow. Sure you are. Blake exhaled, resetting himself. He had been playing defense too much. It was time to switch things up. The next time Malik went for a drive, Blake anticipated it. He stepped in, blocking the path, and when Malik tried to cross over, Blake stole the ball. The crowd erupted in surprised cheers. Malik froze, looking stunned for half a second. Then, Blake grinned. Guess I got a little speed left after all. Malik narrowed his eyes, but Blake could see it, the shift. For the first time, Malik wasn't looking at him like an outsider. Like progress. That night, as Blake left the center, Terrence Wilkes was waiting for him outside. Blake slowed his steps. Something you need? Wilkes studied him, arms crossed. You know, I didn't think you were going to last this long. Blake smirked. I'm full of surprises. Wilkes nodded, then tilted his head. But tell me something, cop. Are you just going through the motions, or do you actually give a damn now? Blake didn't answer right away, because for the first time, he wasn't sure. Wilkes smirked. Yeah, that's what I thought. Then he turned and walked off, leaving Blake standing there, alone with a question he didn't know how to answer. For the first time since his punishment began, Blake Reynolds didn't dread going to the Eastwood Community Center. Something had changed after that basketball game with Malik. The way people looked at him had shifted, just a little. The stares weren't as hostile. The whispers weren't as sharp. The tension that followed him around like a dark cloud had lightened just a bit. He wasn't accepted. Not yet. But he wasn't completely hated anymore, either. And that was new. The next morning, Blake arrived early. He wasn't scheduled to be in for another hour, but he felt restless. Something inside him was different now. For the first time, he wasn't just trying to survive this month. He wanted to do something. He walked into the cafeteria, expecting to find the usual volunteers setting up for the breakfast shift. Instead, he found Judge Elijah Carter, sitting at a table, waiting for him. Blake stopped in his tracks, his stomach twisting. Carter glanced up, raising an eyebrow. Didn't expect you to be early. Blake exhaled slowly, stepping forward. Didn't expect to see you here. Carter nodded toward the seat across from him. Sit. Blake hesitated but obeyed. A heavy silence stretched between them. Then, I heard about the game, Carter said. Blake smirked slightly. You mean the one where I got my ass handed to me? Carter chuckled. That's the one. Blake rubbed the back of his neck. At least I didn't lose too bad. Carter studied him for a moment. You know what that game was really about, don't you? Blake's smirk faded. Because yes, he did. It wasn't about basketball. It was about Malik testing him, seeing if Blake would quit when things got hard. And when Blake had stuck it out, something had changed. Carter exhaled. You took your first step, Reynolds. Blake frowned. First step toward what? Carter leaned forward, folding his hands on the table. Understanding. Blake swallowed hard. And what happens next? Carter tilted his head. That's up to you. Blake exhaled, running a hand over his face. Why do I feel like no matter what I do, it's never enough? Carter's gaze sharpened. Because for the first time, you're starting to feel what they feel. Blake froze. The words hit deeper than he wanted them to. For years, he had worn his badge like a shield. He had walked into every situation with the knowledge that he was the one in control. And now he wasn't in control at all. And it felt awful. But maybe that was the point. Blake exhaled sharply. I don't know how to fix this. Carter leaned back. Good. Blake frowned. How is that good? Carter gave him a knowing look. Because before, you didn't think there was anything to fix. Blake's breath hitched. Because he wasn't wrong. For the first time in his life, Blake wasn't sure if he was one of the good guys. And that terrified him. That afternoon, Blake was assigned to help with tutoring sessions. It was another one of those tasks that felt beneath him, until he walked in and saw Malik sitting at a table, helping a younger boy with his math homework. Blake stopped, watching for a moment. Malik noticed him immediately. His eyes narrowed. What? You lost again? Blake smirked slightly. Nah, just surprised. Malik arched an eyebrow. Surprised about what? Blake hesitated. Then he told the truth. I didn't think you'd be the type to help kids with their homework. Malik's expression darkened. What? 'Cause I'm from the hood. I can't be smart. Blake winced. Damn it. That wasn't what he meant, but that was exactly how it sounded. Malik scoffed. See? That's your problem, cop. You think you know us, but you don't know anything. Blake exhaled sharply. Then teach me. Malik blinked, caught off guard. Blake met his gaze, his voice steady. If I'm wrong about you, if I'm wrong about all of this, then tell me what I don't see. Malik studied him for a long, tense moment. Then, he smirked slightly. You really want to know? Blake nodded. Malik leaned forward, lowering his voice. Then come with me tonight. Blake frowned. Come where? Malik's smirk widened. You'll see. That night, Blake made a decision. Malik had told him to meet him at a street corner a few blocks from the community center. Wilkes had warned him not to trust it. Even Judge Carter had given him a look that said, be careful. But Blake didn't hesitate, because this was his chance. If he wanted to know what he had been blind to all these years, he had to see it for himself. So for the first time since all of this started, he stepped into the unknown, and what he was about to witness would change him forever. Blake Reynolds stood at the corner of Eastwood and 12th, shifting uncomfortably. The street was dimly lit, the glow of old streetlights flickering overhead. Storefronts were shuttered, graffiti covering their walls. A few people loitered in the distance, their conversations hushed, their eyes scanning him with curiosity and suspicion. He didn't belong here, and everyone knew it. Then, a familiar voice broke through the night. You actually showed up. Blake turned. Malik Carter leaned against a lamppost, hands in his pockets, smirking. Blake exhaled, trying to ignore the unease in his gut. You said you wanted to show me something. Malik pushed off the post and nodded toward a narrow alleyway. Then let's go. Blake hesitated for the first time. Something about the way Malik said it, the weight in his tone, the look in his eyes, made it clear this wasn't some game. This was real and dangerous. Malik noticed his hesitation and scoffed. Scared, Blake's jaw clenched. Without another word, he followed. The alley opened into a backlit behind an abandoned building. Dim lights hung from a single open garage, casting eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. And then Blake saw them. A group of boys, maybe 6 or 7 of them, huddled together. One of them, a tall, broad kid with a scar over his eyebrow, looked up at Malik's approach. What's up, man? Scar Eyebrow nodded, then froze when he saw Blake. His entire body tensed. The hell is this? Blake felt the shift immediately. The relaxed atmosphere was gone. Now it was hostile. Malik held up a hand. Chill, Dre. He's with me. Dre, Scar Eyebrow scowled. You bringing cops now? His gaze flickered to Blake. Man, you got a death wish or something? Blake stood rigid, resisting the instinct to reach for a weapon he no longer had. Malik rolled his eyes. He ain't a cop tonight. Dre's eyes narrowed. That don't mean we forgot what he is. Blake felt the tension creeping in. This was a mistake. Malik smirked at him. You wanted to see what you've been missing, right? Blake swallowed hard. Yeah, but not like this. Dre stepped closer. You ever been here before, cop? Blake held his ground. No. Dre chuckled darkly. Course you haven't. The group watched him carefully, eyes filled with something Blake recognized too well. Distrust. Hatred. Like he was a ticking bomb, just waiting to turn on them. And maybe, once upon a time, he would have. Malik folded his arms. You want to see how we live? Then shut up and watch. Then, without another word, he pulled a wad of cash from his pocket and handed it to a kid sitting on a crate. Blake's stomach dropped. He knew what this was, a drug deal, and he was standing right in the middle of it. Every instinct in Blake's body screamed at him to stop it, to do what he had done 100 times before, to grab Malik, to shove the others against the wall, to call for backup. But there was no backup, no badge, no gun, no power, just him. And this choice. Blake clenched his fists. "Malik," he said lowly, "what are you doing?" Malik barely glanced at him. "Handling business." Blake's chest tightened. This was wrong. But before he could say anything else, Dre stepped closer, voice cold. "You got a problem, cop?" Blake didn't move. His body was tense, ready for a fight he wouldn't win. Malik pocketed something, then turned to face Blake fully. His smirk was gone. His expression was serious. "Now you see." Blake stared. "See what?" Malik tilted his head. "What happens when you don't have options?" Blake's breath caught in his throat. Malik gestured at the group. "You want to know why I'm out here? Why Dre and them are out here?" He stepped forward. "Because you cops make it so we don't got a choice." Blake froze. "This?" Malik held up the cash. "This is survival. The same people you arrest? The ones you treat like criminals? This is all they got." Blake shook his head. "That's not true." Malik's eyes flashed. "Then tell me, cop, where the hell else we supposed to go?" Blake opened his mouth, then closed it, because for the first time, he didn't have an answer. Malik studied his face. Then he chuckled, but it wasn't amused. "That's what I thought." Blake felt sick, because deep down, he knew Malik wasn't lying. It was easy to see these kids as criminals, but he had never asked why they ended up here, why they felt like this was their only path. And now, standing here, stripped of everything he once believed, Blake saw the truth. He had never been a hero. He had been part of the problem. Malik gave him a long look. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. The others followed, leaving Blake standing alone in the dark, his entire world crashing down around him. Because now he had a choice to make: ignore what he saw or do something about it. And for the first time, Blake didn't know which choice was the right one. Blake Reynolds sat on the curb, staring at the empty street. His mind was spinning. What the hell had just happened? One moment, he was standing in front of a drug deal. The next, he was watching everything he believed fall apart. Because Malik had been right. He had spent years arresting people like him, assuming they were nothing but criminals. But now he had seen it up close, and he didn't know what to do. By morning, Blake was back at the Eastwood Community Center, but he wasn't himself. His head was pounding. His stomach was tight. He had a decision to make. For weeks, he had been fighting against the truth, that the badge he wore wasn't always a shield. Sometimes it was a weapon that had destroyed people's lives. And now, for the first time, he had to decide what side he was really on. Judge Elijah Carter found him sitting outside the center, staring into space. He didn't say anything at first, just sat beside him, letting the silence stretch. Then, "You saw it, didn't you?" Blake exhaled sharply. "Yeah." Carter nodded. "And?" Blake rubbed his face. "And I don't know what the hell I'm supposed to do with it." Carter studied him. "You could walk away. Forget what you saw. Go back to your old life." Blake flinched, because that was exactly what he had been considering. Go back to the safe version of himself. The one who didn't ask questions. The one who followed orders. But could he really go back now? Blake shook his head. "I can't." Carter gave him a knowing look. "Then what are you going to do?" Blake hesitated. Then, finally, he said the words he hadn't let himself say before. "I want to be better." Carter didn't smile, didn't pat him on the back. He just nodded, like he had been waiting for Blake to figure it out. "Then start." Blake frowned. "Ow." Carter exhaled. "By going back to your job and doing it differently." Blake's chest tightened. "They won't want me to." Carter smirked. "Then you'll just have to make them." Blake let the words sink in. He was about to walk back into a system designed to resist change. A system that would want him to shut up and follow orders. But now he couldn't. Now he saw what happened when people like him abused their power. And he wasn't willing to look the other way anymore. A week later, Blake Reynolds put his uniform back on. It felt different now. Before, it had been a shield. Now it was a responsibility. When he stepped into the precinct, heads turned. Some officers nodded at him. Others whispered. They had all heard what happened. They knew Judge Carter had let him keep his job. But what they didn't know, Blake wasn't the same cop anymore. As he walked to his desk, he caught sight of a familiar face. Sergeant Davidson, the same man who had trained him. The same man who had laughed when Blake used force against Judge Carter. Davidson smirked. "Glad to see you back, kid." Blake stared at him. Before, he would have nodded. Well, played along. Now he saw Davidson for what he really was. A man who had never questioned his own power. Blake met his eyes. "I'm not the same guy," he said quietly. Davidson chuckled. "Yeah? We'll see about that." Blake didn't smile, didn't laugh, because for the first time, he knew who he was. And he was ready to fight for it. That night, Blake stood outside the Eastwood Community Center. He didn't have to be here. He could have gone home, could have let it all be someone else's problem. But instead, he walked inside. Malik was there playing basketball. He stopped when he saw Blake. The two of them stared at each other. Then, Malik smirked. "You lose again. I'm never letting you live it down." Blake chuckled. "We'll see." And for the first time in his life, Blake Reynolds wasn't playing to win. He was playing to understand.